So this week, towards the beginning of the week, I knew that the end of the week was going to be a little busy for me. But towards the beginning of the week, I started praying about what God is it that you have for us this Sunday, this upcoming Sunday, this Mother's Day. And the Lord led me to Joshua chapter 2 in the story of Rahab, and I went, this is kind of weird for a Mother's Day message. So when you're sitting there going, this is kind of weird for a Mother's Day message, I understand that. And I had to allow God to kind of take me through the whole week of digging into this to really fully understand some of that which he was trying to get out of or show me in this story. And I thought, yeah, no, this is a story. This is a message that women need to hear, and not just women, but men need to hear too. But it's something that I've struggled with in my life, and I went, yep, this is okay. I get it. So we spoke on Joshua chapter 1 last week when we talked about Joshua leading the people of Israel into the promised land, so the land of Canaan, right? And so in chapter 2, we have Joshua that sends out these spies into Jericho, right? And they come across this woman named Rahab. And so we're going to kind of read quite a bit of that story. But also we're going to pick up some of the scriptures in the New Testament that talk about Rahab as well. And so we're going to begin chapter 2 of Joshua this morning, starting in verse 1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come tonight to spy on the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out our whole land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that led to the fjords of Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water in the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did in Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of this, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God of heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother and brothers and sisters and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through a window, for the house she lived on was part of the city wall. And she said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. Now the men had said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in a window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother and your brothers and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. Now, Rahab. We have her described in the biblical text as a harlot, right? For the sake of simplicity, because of the word that is used there, we're just going to say someone who maybe isn't living the best way that she can live, right? She's not living out God's plan for her, even though she makes this impassioned speech that your God is God, right? She would have lived in Jericho. She wouldn't have, there's some debate whether she would have maybe had some Israelites within her family as they came into and would have stayed there in the land of Jericho. And so there's this, we're just going to say that Rahab wasn't necessarily living the life that she should be living, right? Not really worshiping God or anything like that, would worship idols. A lot of times Rahab is painted by theologians in a very bad light, and I'm not here trying to defend her, saying that she lived a holy life, right? But I think we need to think about a few things before we label her, before we start to really throw her into the gutter, as some people do. Rahab, in that time, Rahab would have been with her family, right? And she would have been married off unless there was a debt incurred in her family, and then at that point of time, they would have sold off a daughter. And so thinking about that and thinking about Rahab's story, which we don't have a whole lot about Rahab's story, my point in saying all of that is I don't necessarily think Rahab chose this profession, right? What little girl grows up and says, "I want to be a harlot when I grow up," right? There's probably things within Rahab's life that brought her to this point, and some of them may have even been out of her control. Some of them might have been in her control, but I would venture to guess that this wasn't necessarily the way that Rahab thought her life was going to go. But either way, no matter what that part of the story is like, these spies enter her home, right? And one of the things you think about as you think through the story, and I really wrestled with the story this week, was why would the spies enter her home? But men that are coming from another place in the world would come into a city, and maybe it wouldn't be odd for them to go into that kind of house. Some people argue that really Rahab was more of an innkeeper than anything, which it wouldn't have been that odd for them to go to a hotel, right, to an inn. But for whatever reason, however the story plays out, the spies go to the house of Rahab when they enter Jericho. And her house is, as it said in the scripture, in the wall of Jericho. And then, so we think, okay, maybe that's not as odd, right? They're looking for a house that's in the wall so they have easy access to the wall. And so the spies come, and then the king's men know that the spies had come to Rahab's house, and Rahab does something that is kind of odd. She lies, right? She lies for the spies, and she goes, I don't know, they took off. You better go chase them, right? And so the king's men go and chase these spies, and she hides them on her roof, right? And so she tells the spies, and this is kind of where theologians get into this thing. She knows a lot about who God is and what God has done. So does she have Israelites within her family? She would have known this story. This isn't necessarily a story that would just be told in the marketplace, to where she would have to have known this information from somewhere. And she makes this declaration: I know that God has given you this land, and I know that your God is God, right? The Lord. I know that God has given you this land. I've heard what God has done to save your people, and I want to know this God. Can you help me by saving my family? It's a bold request. It's a bold request for her. And that, again, kind of, the theologians kind of start to think about that, because her request is my mother, my father, my sisters, my brothers, right? If she was really living this kind of a harlot life that was way outside of the normal, her family probably wouldn't have had much to do with her. Because even when you weren't an Israelite, this was not the greatest thing. And so she makes a plea for not only herself, but for her mother and her father and her brothers and her sisters. And she says, can you save my family? And the spies agree to it, right, in the story. The spies agree to it, and they say, we will save your family if you tie this crimson cord around your window, and all your family is in your house, right? Like, if they're out of your house, we can't promise anything. But if they are in your house, we will not do anything to them. And then we read on in Joshua chapter 6, where they took Jericho, right? They marched around the Jericho walls, and then the walls fell down. Well, we have to take that into account too, understanding that Rahab's house was in the wall, right? And then they go out, the spies go out, the two that were there to there to spy go out and find Rahab and her family, and they do not harm them. But when we read through this story, we read through this and we go, great, okay, but one of the things that we see within the biblical text that's beautiful is this may be Rahab's story, part of Rahab's story. But this is not the whole of Rahab's story. Rahab's next chapter in her life is very different than what it was in the first. Because Rahab marries, and then she has a son named Boaz. And we've read that story. And Boaz has Obed, and Obed has Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. Rahab was in part of the lineage of Jesus. Can you imagine Rahab holding Boaz and thinking how much her life had changed? Or maybe holding Obed, not understanding that eventually there was going to be a king in her lineage, or that the Messiah would come out of her lineage. Rahab, we see, is mentioned within the New Testament. We know that this part of her story, where she was a harlot, is not the only part of her story. We understand that she's part of the lineage of King David, and therefore part of the lineage of Jesus. But she is mentioned in Hebrews, in the faith chapter, right? By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Within the faith chapter, Rahab is mentioned. And then we also have her mentioned in the book of James. In the same way, it was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did, and she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. Was not even Rahab, right? We're seeing her story mentioned within the biblical text of the New Testament because her story was important. Because we can look at her story and we can see that the first part of Rahab's life didn't determine the direction for the rest of her life. Or to put this another way, one chapter in a book doesn't tell the whole story. And I mean this in our lives, in our personal lives. I mean this in the life of the church, the Big C church. I mean this in the life of our church here in Chariton, the life of our town. One chapter in a book doesn't tell the whole story. Was not even Rahab. Was not even, you fill in the blank, your name. Part of the power we have and part of the power that's given that Rahab took control of was the power of finding out who she was in God's eyes, recognizing God as Lord and finding out who she was in God's eyes. In God's eyes, not the eyes of the world, right? She didn't let her past define her future. And what a bright future that was, right? The great-grandmother of King David, great-great-grandmother of King David. This is one chapter in her life that she didn't let define the rest of her life. This is one chapter, but it wasn't the whole story. She realized who God was and who she was to God. So this is where I'm going to make the points again that we're supposed to get out of this, the points that God had showed me in this story. In the story of Rahab, which I agree is slightly odd for a Mother's Day story, but it's so beautiful. One chapter of the book doesn't tell the whole story, right? You're never so far gone that is the whole story of your life. You can make changes in your life to tell a better story, right? You don't have to assume just because this is the way that you've always been, it's the way that you always have to be, right? You can make the changes in your own story. You can let God lead the next chapter. Just maybe because you've had some rough chapters doesn't mean that that's the whole story. As I was thinking through this, I thought about an encounter I had with a high school friend. She was a good friend of mine my last couple years in high school, and she graduated before me. And I was friends with her, and then we kind of had a falling out. And then after I had Elaine, I tried to connect with her again. She reached out, and we tried to connect. And she tells me after our first time kind of coming together and going out for lunch and everything, which I had just had Elaine, and she goes, "You've changed a lot since high school." And I'm like, well, I'm an adult now, right? And I have a kid and a husband. Like, I have changed. And she's like, well, it's not necessarily a good way. Well, she didn't like the changes, right? But I had to change, right? The next chapter of my life had started, and I wasn't going to continue on living my life the way that I did in high school, right? But to that point, she had. And so our friendship kind of fell by the wayside. But I recognized, I think we'd have all recognized how we've changed in our lives from when we were a kid, or when we were in high school, or when we were in college, or when we had a family, or even when we were mom, or when we were grandma, right? Those that are grandmas, I'm sure that you can say, my life has changed. Like, there's been different chapters. There's been different chapters, and it's really, I just want to hit this home. One chapter in the book doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't matter. I mean, I can't say it doesn't matter, but when we've had things like that and we've recognized who God is and we allow God to come into our life and wash that clean, that's just one chapter in our story. It's not the whole book. Another thing that I really want us to understand out of this is God defines who we are. It isn't the world that defines who we are. If Rahab would have decided, well, all I am is a harlot, and all I will ever be is a harlot, we wouldn't have seen the beautiful things that happened to her life. Because she started to see who she was in God's eyes. We sang that song, I am who you say I am. Because we don't have to be defined with who the world says we are. We need to find our value in the way that God values us. Not in what people say about us. I mean, we can take feedback, right? But if we have one part of our life that we've lived a chapter that maybe isn't the greatest chapter of our life, we don't have to continue to live there. We don't have to continue to let that chapter define who we are, because one chapter doesn't tell the whole story, right? Just like Rahab, that one chapter did not tell the whole story. There was a beautiful story that came from that. And another thing, another point I want to make sure that we understand is it's never too late to make those changes. Maybe there's something in our lives that God's really been speaking to us about, that He's truly asking us to change in our lives. Like He is saying, this really needs to change. And it could be a myriad of different things, right? It could be that and I don't think anybody in this room, but I'm trying to come up with just examples. It could be that we're a smoker, and God says, this needs to change about you. This doesn't have to be your whole story, right? You can change that. Even, I understand it gets hard, but if God's asking you to make these changes, He will help through that, right? It's never too late to make that change. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's an attitude. Maybe it's a heart attitude. Maybe it's a thought pattern. Maybe it's a quick-temperedness. If God is asking us to change these things in our lives, it's never too late to make those changes. It's never too late. We can't just say, well, Lord, this is the way I've always been, and this is the way that I will always be. That doesn't work with God. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed that, but it doesn't really work. He will continue to speak to our hearts and say, this needs to get cleaned up about you. And when we have agreed, when we've come in and we've said, Lord, make and mold me, this is part of the process, right? Maybe we're 90 years old before God speaks to us about something and says, this needs to change. It's never too late to make those kinds of changes. I pray that we have the courage, like Rahab, to step out and to live our lives that way. By faith, right? By faith. By faith, we can live our lives that way. By faith, we can step out and make those changes And by faith, we can understand who we are in God's eyes. And we can understand that maybe some of those chapters that weren't the greatest don't tell the whole story. And taking that thought all the way through, we can understand that in other people's stories, one chapter doesn't tell the whole story. And we can have empathy, and we can understand that just because they were doesn't mean they are. Just because they were like this doesn't mean that they will continue to be like that. People can change. We're going to sing our final song for today. We're going to sing Made for More. I know that we sang that just a couple weeks ago, but as I was thinking through this sermon and the songs, I couldn't do anything less than this song. Like I couldn't do, not that other songs are less, but this song seemed to hit the nail on the head, just to use that saying. This was a song that some of the seniors had sung at Baccalaureate, and I just couldn't help but moving. I understand Baccalaureate's a bunch of churches kind of coming together, and I could not stop. Like, I wanted to just raise my hands in praise, and I just kind of settled for sitting there like this. Because I didn't want to look like the weirdo, but I understand that sometimes we have to look like weirdos. Anyway, we are going to sing Made for More, because we understand that we weren't made to be tended in a grave, right? We were made for more. Let's sing this song together, those of you that want to stand for